Yeah, before we dive into the subject, let us mention just a quick words on SHA-3. So we're a French cybersecurity firm that empowers chip makers and security labs to understand how real devices behave under physical attacks. Our flagship platform, esDynamic, brings all your benches, tools, projects, and automation in one place in a way that you can do your entire attack workflow from data acquisition to exploitation without leaving the platform. Over the past few years, we have poured our research straight into our platform. It ships reproducible test benches for many schemes, such as lattice-based schemes like MLChem, for example, with ready-to-use leakage assessment scripts, reference countermeasure libraries, so your team can benchmark fixes as fast as they find flaws. Here are some our old edition on Keccak content. And yeah, in short, esDynamic lets you move from theory to silicon level evidence in hours and not weeks. And that is exactly the mindset that we will be using in today's webinar. So yeah, let's get started.
Thank you, Andre. So let's start with a brief overview of SHA-3 and Keccak. So first and foremost, let's make sure we all agree on what's a hash function. So a hash function, as shown in the illustration on the right, it's a function that resembles a sponge, having the following properties. It can have varying length input, so the sponge can absorb as much water as it desires, but it has a fixed length output. When we squeeze the sponge, we only get one drop. Additionally, the function is deterministic, which means that give it the input twice, it should always output the same output. Also, we require that the function be uniform, meaning that it should not be statistically biased. And finally, we would like to have an efficient evaluation of that function because it's going to be used many, many times in different algorithms. Now, moving on to the security properties that we require a hash function to satisfy. The first one is pre-image resistance or one-wayness, and it's stated as follows. For any specified output, it is computationally infeasible to find an input which hashes to that output. So basically, we require the function to be one-way. The second security requirement that shall be respected is the second pre-image resistance or the weak collision resistance, where here, for a specified input, it is computationally infeasible to find a second distinct input which hashes to the same output. And finally, we have the collision resistance or the strong collision resistance, which is stated as follows. It is computationally infeasible to find any two distinct inputs which hash to the same output. So there's a little nuance between the last two security properties, where the first one, the input is specified, and the second one, the attacker has more power as he can fix the two inputs he's going to forge. Now that we know what's a hash function, let's take a look at the timeline of Keccak from design to several standards. So to start, around up until 2005, many events had happened. Most secure hash algorithms were based on the MD5 hash function or the MD family, MD being for message digest or the Merkle-Darmstadt construction. So the secure hash algorithm 1 was theoretically broken at that time, but no practical attack had been demonstrated yet. But the second secure hash algorithm standard 2 was still secure at that time. However, the NIST wanted to do preventive measures, and in 2007, the NIST launched the SHA-3 competition in order to replace the MD family. 5 years later, Keccak won that competition, and 3 years after that, the NIST published FIPS 202, which standardized Keccak as Secure Hash Algorithm 3, or SHA-3. 1 year later, the NIST published a special publication numbered 800-185 in order to give recommendations on how to use Keccak in diverse formats. We will talk about that a bit later. Then in 2017, SHA-1 was practically broken, confirming the preventive measures that the NIST had already took, and urging people to move to SHA-3, even though SHA-2 is still cryptographically secure up until this day. And finally, to show that there's ongoing research on SHA-3 and Keccak, in 2025, the Keccak team, in a partnership with the IETF, published an RFC for 2 new variants of the Keccak algorithm that are much more efficient. And we'll talk about them later on too. So now that we know how the SHA-3 family came to life, let's take a look at what's in that family. So we've got 4 hash functions. This is the same illustration as before. We've got each of them differ in the digest length, which means that the output length is different for each one of these 4 hash functions. And this output length specifies the collision security for each one. So the first one has a 112-bit collision security, the second one 128-bit collision security, and so on. So you might be wondering, why do we have a 112-bit version? Well, we should recall that the NIST SHA-3 competition was launched in 2007, and at that time, triple DES was still being used, which had a security of 112 bits. So nowadays, this version should be considered deprecated and should not be used in favor of its other 3 siblings. More interestingly, the NIST also standardized a new type of function, which are called extendable output functions, or XOFs. So we've got roughly the same illustration as before. We also have the sponge that can absorb as many water as it desires. However, the difference is that we have an extendable length output. So the waterfall illustrates the fact that we can have an output of any desired length. And there are 2 of these functions that have been standardized, Shake 128 and Shake 256, respectively for 128-bit security and 256-bit security. Great. So now that we're a bit familiar with what's SHA-3 and what's Keccak, let's see the application of Keccak and why it is important. Why did we do this webinar in the first place? So Keccak has been used in many different standards. The first and foremost is the one from the 3rd generation partnership project on the mobile broadband standard, where Keccak has been used in the 2AC algorithm set, which is used in 4G and 5G networks to secure the communications, and more precisely for authentication and pre-agreement. More recently, Keccak, SHA-3, and Shake have been heavily used in almost all post-quantum cryptography algorithms. So from the 3 standards that have been published up until now, MLChem, MLDSA, and SLHDSA, they have been used for multiple purposes, including, but not limited to, hashing internal values, as extendable output functions, as pseudo-random number generators, as seed expansion, in order to store more efficiently the private and public keys. More specifically, for a key encapsulation mechanism, SHA-3 and its variants have been used as a key derivation function, from which we will be able to derive the secret shared key between the 2 parties executing MLChem. On the signature side, SHA-3 is used in order to produce message digest, so in order to hash the message of varying length, in order to produce a message digest, which itself will be assigned. And finally, more specifically to SLHDSA, SHA-3 is the base hard problem for this signature. So SLHDSA does not assume number theoretic hardness. However, it relies on the security properties that define hash functions. So the 3 properties that we've mentioned before: one-wayness, weak and strong collision security. Then, as we stated, in 2016, 1 year after standardizing SHA-3, the NIST published a special publication in order to extend what could be done with SHA-3 and Shake. The first function that they defined is the customizable shake, C-shake, and as its name implies, it's going to be used in order to create customizable function. So the first one is KMAC, or Keccak message authentication code, which let us authenticate messages and ensure their integrity. The second function that has been proposed is tuple hash. So this function is useful if you'd like to hash different tuples of data. And for instance, if I would like to hash AB and CD, the first tuple, but I do not want to use the simple concatenation, which would output the same thing if I would hash ABC, comma D. Using tuple hash would give us different outputs for each tuple. And finally, the last proposed function is parallel hash, which make use of modern processor parallelism in order to enhance the efficiency of Shake and Keccak implementations. So now that we know why Keccak is present almost everywhere in the present and more in the future when we're going to have PQC all over the place, let's take a look at the Keccak algorithm in depth. So you've seen in the illustration we used a sponge. We used a sponge in order to illustrate the sponge construction that is used by SHA-3 and Shake. So SHA-2 was based on Merkle-Damgard construction, which itself is based on compression functions. So here, when we want to hash a message, we're going to divide it into multiple blocks, and when we no longer have any block to process, we cannot do much. However, in the sponge construction, we have two phases, an absorbing and a squeezing phase. So this sponge construction, as we said, it absorbs bits, it absorbs water and squeezes them out. It squeezes the bit out. So how does it work? It has an internal state that is divided into two parts, the rate R and the capacity C here. And it operates in two phases, absorbing phase and then the squeezing phase, where in the absorbing phase, the input is XORed to the rate portion of the state R bits at a time, which means that having an input, we're going to pad it if needed in order to be able to divide it into equally R bit blocks. And then we're going to absorb each block in order to transform our dehydrated SpongeBob SquarePants here, he's a bit sad, into a hydrated sponge who's happy. Great. Now that we've finished absorbing our message, we will want to squeeze it out in order to make SpongeBob sad again. So what happens is that we're going to squeeze the rate portion of the state R bits at a time. But there's a part of the state that we did not mention yet, which is the capacity C. Well, it's very important because it defines the security. As stated during the absorbing of the squeezing phase, we only reveal the R part of the state. We only reveal this part here. We never reveal the capacity part. And indeed, that's what makes the function one way in some sort. So as the capacity increases, the rate will decrease. However, the security of the sponge construction will increase. We'll see that a bit later. Now, in between each of the absorbing or squeezing iteration, there's a Keccak F permutations. There's a Keccak F permutation that processes the state. Let's take a look at what it does. So the internal state, we said that it's divided into a rate and a capacity. It's illustrated here for the rate and the capacity of Shake 256 specifically. This state has a size that was a parameter at first when the Keccak team published their candidate for the NIST competition. However, in the NIST standard, so in SHA-3 standard, FIPS 202, only the biggest permutation is used, and it's of size 1600 bits. So this state is represented as a 5 by 5 by 64 matrix, filled up starting from the z-axis, then the x-axis, and then the y-axis. Here are some vocabulary that might be interesting when we want to define the operation on this state. The operations on this state will mainly use column and lane, and it's important to note here that Keccak F operations can be easily defined using lanes or portion of lanes. So as it's a matrix that has a 64 component, it's going to be interesting to implement it on a 64-bit architecture. And as we can define these operations in portion of lanes, we can define them with half a lane. So 32-bit architecture um, is also great for implementing Keccak and SHA-3. And then 16-bit when we use a quarter lane and so on. So it was a good choice. Now, moving on to the operations that this Keccak F permutation does, it's also called Keccak P. You might see that in the literature when you're going to read articles dating before the standardization, because in the candidate proposal, it was called Keccak P, but in the standard of the NIST, it's called Keccak F. So there are 5 sub-steps, which altogether form a round. So we've got the theta function, rho, pi, chi, iota, forming a round. And in the NIST standard, we total 24 rounds inside one Keccak F permutation. But as we said that in 2025, there has been an RFC on TurboShake and Kangaroo 12, which are variants bringing down the rounds from 24 till 12 rounds, because much cryptanalytical effort had been done, but no one had been able to break SHA-3 Keccak from any round near 12 rounds, and here we gain in efficiency. Finally, it's important to note that every step is invertible, though the inverse is not straightforward. But the internal state must be kept secret at all times, at least the capacity part. And this does not contradict the one-wayness of the function, the fact that it's inversible, because we only output the rate. We never show the capacity. So having a bigger capacity makes it more difficult to inverse. Now let's take a look at each substep alone, starting with the theta function. So the theta step ensures immediate diffusion by XORing each column with the parity of two other columns. So it works as follows in 3 steps. You've got theta 1, which computes the column parities, which means that it XORs all the bits of every column and it notes them C or theta plane here. Then the second step, called theta 2, will XOR the 2 parties for every column, having a quantity noted D. And finally, theta 3 will XOR the corresponding bits D to the column of the state. And to know which column should we pick in order to do the XOR, we use the position of the bit inside the state, which will give us which column we should use in order to do the XOR. So at the end of theta, each output bit depends on 11 input bits. This is crucial operation for sidechain analysis. We'll see that with Andre later. Next, there are 2 permutations called rho and pi, where rho is a permutation of the bits of every lane, represented in this illustration, and pi is a permutation of the lane, presented here. So we're not going to talk much about them because they are not relevant for the subsequent attacks we'll show. And note that there's no Hamming weight leakage with these permutations. However, we could have a Hamming distance leakage because we mix the bits apart. Moving on to the last 2 substeps, we've got the chi step, which is nonlinear, and this makes it a great sidechain analysis target, just like S-boxes in AES, which we love to attack. So each resulting bit will depend on 3 bits of its row. And this may require a bigger guessing space because it comes after the diffusion of theta. However, it doesn't make the attack impossible, only harder. And the final step, iota, is round dependent. It XORs a constant to the lane x0, y0, and it's not relevant for the subsequent attacks, so I'm not going to talk much about it here. Thank you. On to the attack analysis with Andre.
Yes, thank you, Jad. Now that we have a better understanding of how Keccak works, let us dive into the sectional analysis of Keccak. So we are going to start talking about differential attacks. You must be already aware of that. as it really is the ABC of side channel analysis, but we are going to remind a little bit what differential attacks are all about. So basically what they do is that they target an intermediate value that depends on both public and secret data. What you will do is guess the secret value and see if the computed intermediate value matches with the traces with your physical quantity according to a leakage model, which could be straight up value or a Hamming weight or Hamming distance or else. And this matching between your physical quantity and your intermediate value with your leakage model is going to be done using a statistical distinguisher. And the most notable one, of course, is the CPA, the correlation power analysis, but there are many others. We could mention ANOVA or MIA, for instance. And the big strength of differential attacks is that we could have a divide and conquer approach, which means you would only guess portions of the secret separately and not guess the whole secret at one, obviously. And to be able to perform these differential attacks, you would need multiple traces with the same secrets, but with different public data. You need to have some variance for the statistical distinguisher to work. And unfortunately, this is not relevant in every scenario. An attacker may not always be in possession of multiple traces with the same secrets and varying public data. So now let us take a look back at the applications that Jad mentioned to better understand the different scenarios and how we could attack each individual use of Keccak. So starting with KMAC. KMAC is essentially the Keccak sponge construction applied to a customization string S, a key K, and a message M. L here is the length of the digest. So in KMAC, the secret K is static, and depending on the scenario, the attacker may know a varying customization string S, which would be ideal for the attacker, and or a varying known message M. And so in that case, KMAC could be very well targeted with differential attacks, as the attacker may acquire multiple traces with the same secret and different public data. Now, if we take a look at MLChem and MLDSA and their usage of Keccak, unfortunately, the input Keccak is secret, but it's also ephemeral, meaning that it changes at every call, since Keccak is mostly used for randomness, and you do not want to use the same random every time, of course. And in that case, only a single trace is available to the attacker with the same secret. And one thing to note also is that both the input and the output of Keccak is unknown to the attacker. So there is really no known data at all that varies. So it cannot be targeted with differential attacks, unfortunately. But this doesn't mean that it is safe from all side channel attacks. And in fact, single trace attacks exist. And the most notable ones are template attacks and its improvements, the soft analytical side channel attack. And we are not going to talk much more about them. For today's webinar, we are going to mostly focus on KMAC and how it can be attacked using differential attacks. But note that if you're more interested in how to attack MLChem and MLDSA, specifically targeting Keccak, it is coming in the next release of esDynamic. So let us now see how we can attack KMAC. So as I said before, KMAC absorbs the customization string S, the key K, and the message M. It's really important to note that the key length is not fixed, which means the longer the key, the harder it is to attack, obviously, for the attacker. And there are also two versions of KMAC, 128 and 256, relating to the shake versions they use. And the main difference between them is the rate, which is 168 bytes versus 136 bytes. And for a side channel attacker, the bigger the rate, the easier it is to attack. One important thing to note again on KMAC is the byte padding rule. In fact, it absorbs 3 different inputs, but always separately. And most importantly, the key is never absorbed with controlled data. So as you can see here, the customization string is absorbed first, then the key is being padded to be absorbed separately, and afterwards the message M is also being absorbed separately. So this is really important because prior to KMAC standardization, a lot of really interesting papers targeted Keccak-based MAC, where they didn't have this constraints. So this makes it easier for us to better have some kind of constraints on how the key can be absorbed and the different possible attacks. So let's now see the 2 different scenarios depending on the customization string S and the message M. Let us assume that S is known and variant. So this first part here is known to the attacker and it varies. This means that an attacker could be targeting as soon as the key is being absorbed with the differential attacks. This would lead to a direct key recovery. However, if S is unknown or it is static, it must be static for the attack to work, but M is known and variant, the attacker would have to wait for the key to be fully absorbed and the message to start being absorbed before doing the differential attack. And this would lead to state recovery. And once you've recovered the state, you would be able to forge the max because the customization string S is static, or you would also be able to perform a key recovery. As Jad previously said, every step of the Keccak F permutation is invertible. So let us now try to see the different differential attacks on KMAC 128 and 256. So starting with the first key recovery, which targets the key absorption. So in this setting, the customization string S is known and variant, and this really is the most straightforward attack. So it's basically a simple CPA targeting each absorbing XOR of the key, as you can see here in red. Note that this is an iterative process, which means that the next CPA depends on the last one's results. In fact, before attacking K2, you would need to attack K1 successfully to be able to compute the state before K2 is being absorbed. But in practice, the key is most likely absorbed in 1 round as the rate is quite big. A symmetric key is often less than 136 bytes. So yeah, that was for the first key recovery, the most straightforward in the ideal scenario. So remaining in this ideal scenario where the customization string is known and variant, we can be targeting after the absorption of the key. So let's say the Keccak F permutation right after. And more specifically, theta, the first step. And the first step of theta, theta1, so the column parity computation. This attack becomes really straightforward if the key only fills up the bottom plane here in blue. In fact, in that case, there is at most 1 bit unknown per column. So 1 blue bit per column. And yeah, just targeting theta1 would directly give you the key bits you would be attacking. Note that this would work only for a key that is less than 35 bytes. Here we take into account the byte padding rule. Yeah, so that was key recovery 2. Let us move on to the other scenario where S is unknown and static, but M is known and varies. So in this attack, you will need to go about it in 2 steps. So the first one, you would be recovering the rate, targeting the absorbing XOR here. And afterwards, to recover the capacity, you would be targeting the Keccak F permutation. So in this first step, it is really straightforward. You attack the absorbing XOR and you recover the rates. All right, so as you can see on the pictures here, it makes up for the vast majority of the state already. So moving to step 2, which is to recover the capacity, we're going to be first targeting theta 1 as it is the first operation being performed. Just like we mentioned before, if there is at most one unknown bit per column, we directly recover the bit itself. So for KMAC 128, this is enough to recover the whole state. However, in KMAC 256, there are only these two that will be directly recovered. And all of those columns, there are more than one unknown bit. In fact, there are two. So the attack would only give you what I call here the column parities, which is the XOR between the two bits of each column. Note that depending on the implementation, you can be able to recover the whole state in KMAC 256. In fact, if the column parity is being computed from the bottom up, so let's say XOR this one with this one, with this one, with this one, you could perform an attack to recover this, and then XOR with this one. So in 2 CPA, you could be able to recover the whole state. However, we're going to make the assumption that the implementation doesn't work like this on the bottom up, and we're going to need to perform another attack for KMAC 256, which is to target theta 3 to recover the remaining bits. So remember, theta 3 is the XOR between the initial bits and two column parities. Yeah, so that was it for state recovery 1. And for state recovery 2, so Jad mentioned that there is one nonlinear operation, which is chi, and that it could be very beneficial for differential attacks. As we know, we love to target the S boxes in AES. So we may want to profit from this nonlinearity. And it is possible. In fact, when targeting chi, it is mostly practical to perform a state recovery regardless of the scenario, because in that way, we don't have to deal with a big guessing space as chi comes after diffusion, which is done by theta. And this has been done in practice by Samuel and Damon in 2017. So this is also a possible attack. Now, let us move on to a use case on KMAC 256. And yeah, let's go. Before jumping into the attack itself, we're going to just tell you what dataset we use, really. And to generate the dataset, we leveraged emulation with our tool that is called esFirmware. And so we emulated an unprotected ARM Cortex-M4 implementation of KMAC for STM32. And to do so, we did not need any real device. We only needed the firmware. And the generation is really straightforward, as we can hook any function or instruction and easily manipulate all of the input and outputs. And concretely, to generate the trace, what we do is, for every instruction, the chosen registers are recorded to create the trace based on a chosen leakage model. And what we chose here is all of the main registers. And the leakage model was the sum of the Hamming weights. And as you can see here, you have an example of an emulated trace of KMAC 256. And so for every sample, there is one instruction. All right, let us now jump into the use case itself. So this is a notebook replay. This is a video. Let me put that in full screen. And yeah. So here I'm searching for KMAC on the knowledge center of esDynamic. To open the notebook, I see the use case on KMAC 256 state recovery. I open it. I wait for it to load. I put it in full screen. And yeah. So the first thing we do is import all of the libraries. Then we open the data set here. And as you can see, we have 5,000 traces with some useful metadata like the customization string, the key, and the message. Then we check for alignment. Yeah, let us zoom in a little bit. And yeah, as you can see, there is no jitter at all. It is really fully unprotected. So there's no synchronization to be done here. But we would like here to identify the suboperation a little bit better. So we applied pre-processing with a moving variance. And as you can see here, we have this pattern, and this pattern repeating, which are actually the absorbing XORs. So this absorbs the customization string, this absorbs the key, and this absorbs the message. And in between is the Keccak F permutation. So let us zoom in a little bit on the Keccak F permutation. Yep, what we do here. And you can see here, if you squint your eyes enough, a little pattern that is actually being repeated here, 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 and so on. And if you count them, you're going to see there are 24. So we can actually identify the rounds of the Keccak F permutation in the trace. So this is really useful because we are going to be able to precisely define frames of the operations of interest, which in that case is the absorbing of the message M and the first round of the Keccak F permutation. So before performing the attack here, you have a brief reminder of what we're going to do. So it's in 3 steps. So the first one is to recover the rates, and the other 2 are to recover the capacity. Moving on to step 1, which is starting the absorbing of the message. So first we define a selection function for the message absorption using our side channel analysis on Keccak library, which is called esKeccak. And then we plug it into an attack object with our frame, our selection function, the leakage model, the distinguisher, which is a CPA, and the discriminant here, which is the maximum of the score because we are targeting XOR operation. So yeah, we just wait for the attack to run. It's going to take a few seconds. Yeah. So here we have the results, and as you can see, there are a lot of red. So although some bytes are being recovered, most of them are not. And you can see that the found values, our best candidate is 0. And this is because we're targeting XOR and we're actually seeing the leakage of the plaintext here, the message M too much. It's being very parasitic to the attack. So what we need to do is to exclude those samples where the message M is leaking too much. And what we decided to do is that we noticed that in the end of the operation, we see some leakage peaks. And so we refined that frame to the very end of the computation of the absorbing XOR. So we just changed the frame to exclude the leakage of the message, rerun the attack, and this time we're happy. It's all green. So yeah, we look at different bytes. Let us look at all the way. And yeah, every byte has been recovered. So we have recovered 136 bytes. So we store the results and we move on to step 2, feature 1. So once again, we define the selection function corresponding to the operation that is being targeted. We change the frame to the round 1 of the Keccak F permutation and we just run the attack. And this time, no problem. It's great. It works. And you can see that the leakage peak is actually at the beginning of the frame, which is to be expected because beta 1 is the first operation being done in the Keccak F permutation. So we now have successfully recovered 16 other bytes, which are right there. And what I call here the column parities, which is the XOR of the 24 unknown couples left. So we store the results and we move on to theta 3 to recover the remaining bytes. So same thing, selection function, attack object, run the attack. So this is what we do here. once again, you have to wait for the results to show up. And yeah, as you can see, the attack unfortunately does not work. And this is to be expected because theta3 XORs every bit of the column with the same parities. So we are expecting ghost peaks. And actually, the 2 bytes that of every column that we are missing are being XORed with the same parities. So this is why we only have 24 here bytes for the 24 couples. We did not do 1 for each byte. Yeah, this was to be expected. And we can overcome this issue by using our previous results of the CPA. In fact, we know the value, the XOR value of the bits of every column. So we are going to use that and the result of the CPA we just did to combine the highest peak correlation. So we take all the possible couples that respect the column parities that we know, and we then compute the highest, we then use the sum of squares to compute the highest peak of correlation between those 2 bytes. This is what we do here. And so at this point, we now have recovered, as we know, this power of the state. And we now have every couple, but we do not know which is which. We know that in where column they belong, but we don't know if, let's say here, V1 is at the top or at the bottom. So brute forcing the 2 possible permutations for all of the 24 couples would lead to a 2 to the power 24 complexity, which is doable, but still pretty big. So we are gonna reduce that down before performing the final MAC forgery attack. So here we move on to step 4, which is brute force and MAC forgery. And we are going to make use of our knowledge of the architecture. It's an implementation for an STM32, so the targeted architecture is 32 bits. So 4 bytes are always grouped together into a 32-bit word. So here we have a little illustration. So here we have the different couples looking at it from the z-axis, and we don't know which is which. However, since they are grouped 4 bytes together, we can see that, oh, these 4 are actually, the leakage timing actually is the same between these 4 and between these 4. So they know they belong to the same lane. And that way we can reduce down the complexity down to 2 to the power of 6. And yeah, this is much, much more doable. So to move on to the brute forcing, what we do is we try every possible combination by guessing the states. We then forge a MAC and request a verifying oracle that either tells us no, in that case we need to try another guess, or yes, in that case the MAC is forged and the state has been successfully recovered. So we have a little function here that basically does this. In that loop right here, we just compute the state using our guesses. Here we forge the MAC using our library, and there we request the verifying oracle. So we define the function, and we just run it with that cell at the very bottom. Yeah, that one. And you can see it's pretty much very quick, and we have successfully recovered the state and forged the MAC. And once you've done this, you can also, if you want, you can also revert the Keccak F permutation to have access to the secret key. So yeah, that was it for the use case, and we can now wrap it up.
Thank you, Andre. So let's wrap it up. So as a recap, we showed a simple side channel attack on Keccak in the context of KMAC. However, there's much work to be done in order to protect Keccak from different other attacks. So Keccak is also vulnerable to a physical attacker in MLK and MLDSA standards. And we only mentioned side channel analysis here. However, Keccak is also vulnerable to fault injection attacks. Here is a small sample of the content that we have on these subjects. So fault injection attacks for Keccak on MLChem and MLDSA, and single trace attacks on Keccak with soft analytical side channel analysis. If you'd like to see more on this, please fill the feedback survey that we're going to have after the webinar. And if we have enough interest, we might do a second webinar focused solely on post-quantum cryptography and Keccak. So thank you. And if you have any questions, we can now take them. So there's a first question. Keccak SKML. How are you sure that the length of SK and M are so suitable that they are not mixed in some chunks? Each chunk must be 1,600 bits long. I think it was answered in the slide where you talked about the pipe padding rule.
Yeah, it does not need to be 1,600 bit long, but only the rate, like R bits long, which is just the rate. And yeah, there's a padding that is being done to S, K, and M, which makes sure that it's being padded to be a multiple of R. But thank you for the question. In cycle analysis, I'm not sure. So yeah, I meant the question, how hard is the protection of Keccak compared to SHA-2 or SHA-1? In cycle analysis, I know that both Keccak and SHA-2 can be attacked, and it really depends on the countermeasures you will be adding to it. There was a paper by Maillard that inspected the security of Keccak and SHA-2 against signal trace attacks, and they actually showed that Keccak is a little bit more resistant to soft analytical side-chain attacks, so this is good to note. And from a cryptanalytic point of view, I'm not sure, maybe you have more info on it, I don't know. Okay. Which operation did you attack inside the SHA-3? Is it theta or chi? What is the main cause of ghost peaks? So yeah, here on the use case that we showed, we attacked the absorbing XOR and theta. So we did not attack chi. And what is the main cause of ghost peaks? In the absorbing XOR, since we're attacking M XOR the state that we want to recover, we are guessing the state. But for the guess 0, this would only be the message M, and the message M is expected to leak. So this is why we had ghost peak in that operation, because of the plain text leakage that you'd see on, let's say, also AES when we're attacking add-run key. And when we were targeting theta3, we saw ghost peaks because all of the bytes of the column are XORed with the same parities. So this is why we had ghost peaks as well. Maybe you want to add something? In terms of timing, how long does it take to mount the attack to extract the largest key size? And you then said SHA-3 512. I assume in SHA-3 512 there is no key. This is only a hash function. I assume you may be talking about KMAC. And in KMAC standards, the NIST doesn't actually specify a reasonable maximum key length. It's 2 to the power of it's unimaginable. It's basically to tell us that we could use any key size. So it's like I cannot tell you for the largest key size. And then we have, you chose the XOR as the target for the selection function. I wonder how you can obtain a unique correct key candidate in the CPA when using a linear operation as the selection function. Could you please give more details on this point? I do not see the detail of the selection function in the slides. Yeah, in fact, we did not present them. I'm not sure if you are talking about theta1, theta3, or the absorbing XOR. I assume you mean theta3 as it's the most confusing. And basically, for theta3, we have a lot of candidates that have a really high correlation. And to select the 2 correct ones, what we did was we knew the XOR value between the 2 bytes that we wanted to recover. So although there were multiple really good candidates, using the column parities that we had, we could narrow it down to the two good candidates, if that makes sense. And yeah, all of the details of the selection function are hidden in the library, like in the API. How about a single trace scenario? Did you try? So this content is very new that we showed at the end. So for now, we have done a soft analytical side channel attack on simulation, which, isn't very far from the real scenario. But yeah, we're actually really interested in doing so in a real scenario. But in our notebook, basically, you would have how to run it on a simulation, which could be easily applied to your own real scenario. But this has been done in practice by state-of-the-art papers, though, on a real device. Jad, what is one advice you would like to give for side channel analysis? That is a fun question.
The advice I would give is use a good library, a complete library that will help you go fast and not reinvent the wheel. So there are many open source libraries that are available. So that would be my first advice to give.
What is the success rate of the attack? So are you mentioning the one I'm going to assume you're mentioning the one that we just did, the use case on KMAC. Obviously, the success rate highly depends on the leakage, and note that we're targeting XOR operations, so this can be a little bit more complicated. It could require more traces. So yeah, the success rate highly depends on your implementation, obviously. But if you would like a higher success rate, perhaps targeting Chi would be more practical as it's nonlinear. But it requires more work and it's a little bit more difficult, but a little less straightforward. Yeah.
And concerning the second question about, I believe research suffers from unavailability of open source traces like ASCAD. Do you know any open source traces? I think by ASCAD you refer to the ANSI side channel analysis database. Well, indeed, there's not much open source data to work on, and that's why we developed our simulation tool, ES firmware, to be able to have reproducible attacks, because it's quite costly to have real traces from real devices, and having them in a simulation give us like an ideal scenario where we could at least validate the theory of the side channel attack.
And also on the availability of open source traces, if you're interested, you and Kuhn actually did some single trace attack on SHA-3, and they have open sourced their dataset. They're available. So there are a lot of traces, but yeah, they are available.
So I think that's it. And if you have any more questions, feel free to contact us by email and we will do our best to respond to you. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. And yeah, thank you for attending.